Ask questions of the panelists, but maybe you have something to say or an idea that you'd like to throw out, and maybe get some reaction from the panelists or so forth. So, I mean, this could be, you know, the bigger topics. This is the appropriate time to ask questions about some of the really big, gnarly topics. So, who's up? Here one.
Okay, from Laura. Suggestions as a land manager for things you can do to reduce this, I guess, the speed or the amount of runoff and cold water in one place.
Thank you. That's a good question. So the question, there are a lot of different techniques that can be used to slow runoff and erosion, and that is to increase the surface roughness via vegetation, or to put rocks, structures, detention structures in channels. And so, you know, one thing that we're doing in the Baba Komari that might be useful at the Cienega is to model some different scenarios. So put some structures in here or change management here, and see what the impact downstream is, so that you know, you're making sure to use the best location for that type of thing.
Other questions? I thought I saw one back
For Gary, you mentioned there was a lack of sort of standards or requirements around water quality for those private domestic wells. And do you think that comes from the government responding to the well owners' request for privacy and their strong demand for that independence? Or do you think it comes from a lack of serving those customers?
Me, the question is about, you know, whether or not the lack of water quality standards for private well owners was driven by the private well owners wanting to have privacy for themselves, and they didn't want people to know what their water quality is, or is it something that the state just doesn't want to deal with it? And I explained this way. I can tell you this about that. The realtors do not want water quality information tied to a street address. That's, you can see why. And especially if there's, you know, a well that, you know, we're talking about that. So that I like the fact that in our state, water quality information is considered private information. You'll see a lot of information in the ADWR files about well construction, well this, well that, water, whatever people put in there. But no water, very little water quality information, because it is private. As other states, and I've looked at all 50 of them, they have state agencies that go out and pull the sample and collect the data and keep it, and they tabulate it. You know, we do have water quality information done by researchers, but they take all the information by site specific, and then they put it together into a database, and then they put it out, you know, contoured or colored patterns or something, and so that it's not identifiable. The thing that concerns some of us is whether or not through the Freedom of Information Act people could get that information from the people who preserve it, or do they have laws set up or regulations set up within their own structure to where they're you know, can't disclose it. But private well owners just I don't know. I don't think they ever were organized in any way to go to a state and say, hey, we want to keep it this way. We want it hands off. They did in 1980 when the Groundwater Management Act was passed. There were people that said, I refuse to re-register my well and give them the state the information. But it's none of their business. They don't need to know. And we find them today, and I tell them, well, that's fine, but you don't have a viable source of water. Therefore, you're selling a dry lot or a dry house. I can't do it. It's come back around to the fact where now that they must register it if they want to have identifiable a viable source of water. The lender won't loan them the money if they can't find a well or the right to a well. So it worked for a while, but anyway. No, I just think it's unfortunate that they're still out there and isolated with little or no protection. So, and I'd like to see a limited amount of water quality requirements required for every sale and transaction, but not a one flat across the board federal standard where everybody must treat their water for exactly the same thing. It's got to be something that's a little bit flexible, because there's places where you definitely can find arsenic, and there's other places where it'd just be a waste of money to have tested for that at all. So I'd like, it's going to be a tough one to work out. Thanks for the question.
Any other responses?
Well, I'll say one thing about domestic wells that from when I was at DWR. There were a couple of, in 2000 there was a sort of a re-review of the groundwater management act, and at that time we actually talked a little bit about, well, shouldn't there be the ability to regulate domestic wells, like where you could drill them and reporting it. You know, every time you sort of start to broach that topic in any kind of big public forum where there's lots of different stakeholders, everyone goes, no, we cannot regulate domestic wells. We can't. No, just, and maybe because real estate and it's not that there's this, like you say, there's not this big organization, powerful organization.
They show up individually in mass.
Yes, they show up individually in mass, exactly.
So just a little bit of factual information here for the Cienega watershed boundary, not the groundwater basin, but the watershed boundary. There are 16, as of 2014, according to DWR's records, there are 1,675 exempt wells in the watershed, and there are 130 non-exempt wells in the watershed, of which 122 are outside the AMA. So non-exempt wells are the ones that pump greater, or they're authorized and equipped supposedly to pump greater than 35 gallons per minute. And there's 122 of those that are outside the AMA boundary. So that's kind of the dimensions of groundwater use. Beyond that, we really don't have much else in the way of an understanding of groundwater or groundwater quality, I think, in terms of what people might be, using, unless they've taken their own initiative to get a water quality analysis, because there are very few public water supplies.
Julie, can I ask a question back? Unless we get another question from the audience right now. You mentioned that that's according to the records of the ADWR, but have they been field verified that the wells that are in that count actually exist or actually work today? Because see, that's the bad thing about it's wonderful that we have access to all the well records, but there's no guarantee that the well that's registered there is actually working in the way the paperwork says.
Right. And then, that's not field verified. That's just based on the records. Next.
I'm just curious if there's, the historical counting of perennial and periodic springs and the loss that we've seen over the years.
Well, there is an active effort right now to survey springs, especially the ones on public land, to look at their condition. Sky Island Alliance has been doing a lot of work using volunteers to actually go out and visit places that have springs, mostly on public lands, to look at their condition and rate them according to some standards not standards really, just methods that have been used in the Colorado Plateau. And so for the Cienega, there is actually a report on the Sky Island website that describes the conditions of the springs that they examined. And the work also includes a risk assessment. So a number of the higher elevation springs were rated at risk of, being impaired from either fire suppression or in some cases the potential for really damaging fires. There were other risk factors that were evaluated. Most of the springs occur kind of at high elevation areas, but there is some of that work starting now. And when Pima County, when we begin our ecological monitoring obligations under our Section 10 permit, we will be doing that work on the springs that are in county ownership. We've already started, but we'll have the obligation to continue that.
And the hydrology working group that we've just been forming up and starting to work through some of the groundwater and geology questions in the Sanic Basin. We noted in our last meeting that we need to know where the springs are and what springs are still active and what springs have dried up, and that Sky Island Alliance would be a really good partner to bring into the working group to help us with surveys. I think they've done a lot of work in the Huachucas, but maybe less work in the Santa Marinas, is my impression. And for the folks doing the isotope study, they need to find springs at appropriate elevations to get that isotope signature to understand, because isotopes kind of preserve a signature of the elevation in the season that the water was recharged. So we got water coming out of the spring, you can get an idea of that. And so we expect to be looking more at springs also.
There is an effort that they're making with the Sky Island Alliance for the Cienega Springs to look at the isotope analysis with Chris Easto's lab on campus. So they are now, when they go and look at the springs, they're collecting water to track. So that would be
Integrated.
yeah, useful.
What, somebody in the back there?
Yeah,
we-
I just have a question about private wells. If a homeowner has a private well, but then the municipal water is connected, like comes to their area and it's expanded, are they required to give up that well or to connect to the city water, or can they keep it?
Okay, I'll field that question if I can, and then maybe you can have something also in a minute. Now, within the active management areas, right now, did you say if you already have the private well, if they come in, do they have to hook up? No, I
Well,
do not.
not if they have to hook up. If they choose to hook up to city water, are they required to abandon their well?
That's going to be the policy of the people that you hook up to. I know Tucson Water, because I work there, you know, they're trying to, of course, the fewer private water wells that they have to evaluate when they do their hydrologic impact study of the new well they want to put in, they would like to see them all go away. But they keep very, very close track of the private water wells within their territory. And of course, you know now, or maybe I should say this for everybody that may not know, if you already are on Tucson Water or Metro or Marana or any of those other people that have the 100-year assured supply, you cannot now also get a well drilled. But if you already have the well, and the well goes down, you can replace that well. You can get a permit to keep, you get to keep it. That well is grandfathered in to the system that you can continue to operate. So there are people that have conjunctive use, and they use typically the well water for the irrigation and the municipal water for the house. There have been states like Florida and some other places where it has been upheld by case law, where the people that come in and expand into that area and put in a public supply system can require the people to do away with their well in order to reap the benefits of the pool funds to join the system. But it's case by case, or maybe but I don't know of any place here in Arizona where that's really been a big issue.
Any other responses to that question? Yes, Lou?
I have a question for all of you. I'm just wondering, we're taking all this water out of the ground, and it is being used either drip irrigation or household use or irrigation that's not. Have there been any studies or any evaluation of how much of that is going back to recharge, or not? I mean, have there been any studies? I mean, you'd say from septic tanks, so much goes back into the ground. You'd say from drip irrigation, so much goes into the ground, and plants live up some. And you'd say from spray irrigation, it's less. But have there been any real studies to show, okay, the water's going down 100 feet in 8 years, we're putting in so many orchards, drip, whatever, what's gonna happen? Has this been looked at in a serious way?
I'll just comment for groundwater models. Whenever they develop a groundwater model for an area, they always develop a water budget. And incidental recharge is what they call that. And they always estimate the incidental recharge. And Linda could probably add more to that since she's worked on some very detailed water budgets.
Well, it's true, and there are, and the Department of Water Resources, when I worked there, it had these percentages that were assigned to different kinds of use. Like municipal, they said 4%, and agriculture, it kind of depended on the irrigation method. But since you brought it up, I just want to mention something about septic systems, because I think there's this perception that once the water goes into the septic, into the leach field, then it all goes down. But actually, in order for leach fields to operate, to work, they have to have air exchange. And so I think more work needs to be done on septic tank recharge, because I'm kind of tired of hearing, well, it doesn't matter because it all goes down anyway. Because, a large percentage, I believe, evaporates, because it has to, and I've heard, estimates of like 40% goes down, or 32% goes down, and the rest goes up. So I agree that there are some rules of thumb that are used, but I agree that more research needs to be done, but I think it's probably very geographically specific.
Can I add a little bit of that? It's not research or study of, although there are infiltration studies that can take place on a farmland where people are applying the water because they do want to know, how good is it getting, how fast is it getting down to the root zones. But I can tell you from observations of looking at many old irrigation wells and so on, that the places where flood irrigation was taking place, where in the springtime they would put a bunch of water out there and let it soak in, and then plant the crop, and then do another one, and so on. When you would look at like the retired farmlands that Tucson Water bought, and we had to evaluate all the wells that we acquired at that time, you'd look down in those wells or take the top off of them, and water would just be gushing in through previous older, higher up openings in the, we call it cascading water. And there was major, it would be torrents, the roar was amazing sometimes at how much water was going back in, but it was leaking into the wells and then going straight down to the water table. And of course, that isn't necessarily a good thing. But it is a good thing. But I've noticed recently, in the last 5 or 10 years, of opening up wells, because the irrigation methods are now going to center pivot, and they're more efficient, or to the strip irrigation and so on, that it seems as if that torrent is falling off, and that the cascading water isn't there in the same quantity that it used to be. So I think if you over apply water to the surface, it's going to go down. But if you just use it to make the plant go up, it seems to me like it's just being consumed. That it's just not percolating as deep as it used to.
Right, and a lot of the agricultural efficiency measures are specifically designed so that that's not going to happen. That we're not going to return water to the aquifer. It's just going to be delivered to the root zone of the plants and go back out. And the same with reclaimed water. In the reclaimed water system in Tucson Water, you cannot overuse that water. That's part of your duty as a user, is to only put on there enough to keep the plants alive and irrigate them, and not so much that you're going to irrigate the aquifer, so to speak.
Well, at least in the upper San Pedro area, that's been studied in agonizing detail by ADWR a number of times. So, depending on the irrigation method and the leveling of the field, and there's a lot of formulas in the hydrographic survey report and the AMA report done in 2005. So there's plenty of data out there.
Yeah, and Russ Scott also tried to address that last time. He gave a talk about mesquite management, a different topic, but part of the message was that, at least on the uplands, really you're generally not going to affect the water. You're not going to return a lot of water to the aquifer by removing the mesquite. It's going to basically be cycled within the soil system there, locally, not
That's
get to the aquifer.
infiltration versus recharge wording.
So, I think, Karen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did, and it's kind of for you and kind of for Jean Marie. But you were kind of excited about what I think it was Jean Marie said about the Cienegas, and the source water for those.
Lawrence.
Lawrence,
Yeah.
so, because I'm not a hydrologist, can you explain what the excitement was?
Maybe Laura probably would do the best.
Well, I think the fact that the Cienegas themselves hadn't declined over time is an indication that the surface water in that area was maintained.
Okay.
And if you have these, you mentioned the idea that maybe there were clay layers in that area that help keep the water kind of near the surface. So the more water that you can detain and put into that, what she called the lateral runoff component, basically store it in the soils for later supported wetlands. That's the idea that I'm excited about.
That's what Laura was talking about. I don't think we know the actual source. I mean, there could be a couple reasons why the water in the Cienegas has remained stable. Maybe it's got a fairly deep aquifer source that actually is somehow perforating through that clay layer and coming up to the surface and then being held up by the clay layers. That would be my expectation if drought is not affecting a water source, is that it has a deeper, larger aquifer source rather than just being recharged from floods along the floodplain. But both those sources,
Studies on that?
we haven't,
Look at that.
and we haven't interpreted them to the extent I think we will be with time now. We've got this group kind of working together on them. But both sources may very well apply. There may be some deep aquifer sources maintaining that water even through dry times, and then it may be undoubtedly would be and is augmented by high flows coming through and recharging the floodplain that then releases back into there. But if it's maintained through drought without much effect on the water levels in those wetlands, I would suspect some sort of deep aquifer source that's more resilient to short-term climate changes.
In that case, maybe it's not such a good prognosis. I mean, it's nice that it's still there, but
The climate keeps changing.
It could be that the lag time is long, and we just haven't gotten the effects of.
Yeah, and it seems like augmenting, how much surface water is managing to get into the subsurface rather than just flowing down to the next basin is a good thing for the area you're working in. And especially if you're replacing a process that used to exist 100 years ago and you've lost it because of channel incision.
Yeah. And so, the opportunity is there too, maybe for experimentation. I mean, try some methods out and see what, if it works, if it's consistent with, different theories of how the water gets there and is supported. But to do that, you'd have to have a lot of, monitoring to go with your experiment, right? Let's see, is there anybody, a new person? Okay. Back there, Dave.
Yeah, I can't remember which talk it was either Laura's or Jean Marie's, where you showed a map where most of the Cienega recharge comes from the Santa Ritas, the higher peaks of the Santa Ritas and the wetstones.
I think we both got that.
Yeah, okay, good.
That was awesome. Yes.
Yes.
So then, if that's the case, can you address the kind of the elephant in the room is if the Rosemont mine comes in, since that's further north and on the other side of the drainage from those major sources, what do you think the impact will be if that mine goes in?
Well, I, for myself, can say I've not looked at the Rosemont materials much at all. I read through the groundwater modeling report that Montgomery and Associates did. I kind of read the high points of that. I looked at their maps where they did projections, long-term projections across a broad study area of the Cienegas Basin. And as I recall, this is with the pit, mostly the pit dewater. The pit will evaporate for many, many, many years. And their long-term, 1,000-year projection of water level drawdown was like a foot of drawdown at Empire Gulch. And I just don't know much about it. And that was a model, it was a simulation. I just don't know much about it beyond that. I haven't spent a lot of time on it. And I think that addressing the geology and the recharge processes, getting learning everything we can about those along the basin margin is it's just important for any number of reasons for understanding this system.
I don't have anything to add.
Can I add to that a bit? And I think part of the question might be, like, with that land taken out of commission and none of that water being allowed to enter the system, like, what are we gonna lose in terms of just that recharge area being eliminated from the recharge rate for the Cienega?
So I have looked at that issue, and the Rosemont mine, I did not put the pit location on this, but this map shows in-place recharge. In-place recharge is like, for a given cell, a given square, what is the amount of water on an average annual basis that would recharge? And you can see there's all sorts of different colors. Most of the basin is not contributing to in-place recharge. This doesn't look at stream bed recharge. But, and Wade Osterkamp was talking about the high elevations of the Santa Ritas, which are really largely just even south of here, being a source water for the basin. But the recharge area right here is where the mine pit is located, and it is a high recharge zone, or at least it's thought to be one of those areas. And it provides, the groundwater right now moves in two directions. It moves outward like this and like this, and it supports a groundwater flow that is partly to the upper basin and partly to the lower basin via Davidson Canyon. So this makes this, right now, if you look at it kind of blown up, the contours actually bulge out a bit here. And part of that is because it is a recharge zone. The water is moving from a higher elevation to a lower elevation downward. And that'll basically reverse that condition here so that instead of going this way, the direction of flow will go this way into the pit. And that's what creates the pit lake. So it does have a very important and quick local effect. And then the question is, how far, how fast? And that's where it gets more difficult to say what the effects will be at a distant point in time. The model only looks at 20 years of mining. Most mines run 50 years or longer. Most mines, when they put in the infrastructure for one mine, they're going to go deeper, they're going to go longer, and they're going to go farther than just 20 years. Yes.
Yeah, along that lines of the Rosemont there, one of the big problems is the leaching from tailings. We've got a perfect example over here in the hills south of Patagonia, where all of that old mining, all of a sudden, because we had abundant rain this last year, they now have a real serious pollution problem. And there's one thing you cannot get away from with the mines and the tailings, is that every time it rains, there's leaching. And that leaching is water moving down into the water table.
Right. Let's see, we have two questions, and then I think we have to end at that. No more questions. Over here first. Over here.
I think it was Linda had it in her talk, had industrial water use out in 2016. What is that industrial water use? Because currently it's at 1 acre foot per year.
Right. And so they had, if you look at the data, they have several categories of industrial, and that was almost, there was some that was under like the sand and gravel category, but most of it was under mining.
Okay.
So I'm assuming that when they did the projections, that they assumed that there would be additional mining in the basin.
And Tadion with the USGS estimated in the Cienega watershed that there's already 333 acre feet of industrial and mineral water use based on well pump rates and hours of operation.
That's quite
So
a
that's
bit
quite a bit
different.
higher than what
Well,
DWR.
but I wonder if that's including ag.
No, that's not including
Yeah.
ag.
That seems awfully high.
He estimated there was 884 acre feet of ag.
Yeah.
Is that the groundwater basin?
Different boundaries, maybe?
Yeah.
That was
Yeah,
Cienega
different
Creek.
No, they used.
I don't know.
I don't
Yeah, it would be a groundwater basin.
Yeah.
Site.
Yeah, it must be.
Yeah, so, yeah, something to look at, I don't know who's right. Okay, we had one more question over here.
So I'm not sure if there's even an answer for the question, but, or who on the panel might get best to address it, but somebody asked about the cost of doing the studies earlier. But doesn't not doing the studies have a cost and a risk associated with it? Do we have a way of quantifying or looking at that? Because I mean, it has a huge prediction for what you might choose to do as a community.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you might get out of a groundwater model that's not already in, the Rosemont model or the existing model.
Right, well, first, I think the conceptual modeling part of it is something that can be done relatively low cost, and the more information you have, the more complete your conceptual model will be. But at some point, you have to say, we've got enough to think we've got the overall gross patterns, and from there we can go to a mathematical model if we choose to do that. And that's, the USGS mathematical models, the mod flow models that the USGS builds them, are fairly expensive because they take quite a bit of time, and they're the gold standard. They can go to court and stand up and all that. So there's a lot of time going into making sure they're that precise and that they have that level of QC, quality control. But the conceptual model, I think we can work, like go out and do some geophysical surveys. I'm not sure what that would cost, but it's a discrete cost, and how to compare that to not doing anything, and then the future costs. I mean, I have no idea. I don't know if the economists could try to work that out. But in the end,
What do you think we'd lose if we don't go down that?
well, I think one of the big questions, like I said a little earlier, one of the big questions in my mind is the connection between the mountains and the basin, and how those recharge processes are working across that boundary, you might say. And with Rosemont kind of going in that area, I think it's really important to know that, and how that water then moves down to the Ciénagas. So if we don't know that, I think there could, instead of 1,000 years, who knows? It could be less, it could be more, but it's such speculation now, and so continuing to develop those understanding those processes, I think is pretty critical. But basically groundwater models, mathematical models they do a water budget. They tell you how those water budget components will change in the future with different pumping scenarios or different recharge scenarios. They tell you water level drawdowns, how much storage you're losing from the aquifer under predicted future scenarios of pumping and recharge. So they tell you how much pumping or recharge will affect stream flows and discharge from the basin at springs and streams. So I mean, that's basically what you learn from those models. You can project forward.
There is a month. I mean, there's 3 months just for the Rosemont area, just so you know. So I think part of the question is, what do we gain if we go out to a larger area or a different type of model? I don't know. I mean, if you have other panelists have perspective.
I understand the Rosemont models. Well, like I was just looking over the Montgomery Associates report, and their study area didn't include the wells, around Sonoita. They didn't have any of the other pumping uses.
None of the other uses were included in that study.
So that's not very predictive of the whole system.
I think one thing that needs to be considered is, something that we were talking about at the break, and the fact that, sometimes we do something and we don't really feel the repercussions of our management actions or any of our actions until sometimes maybe you're too far down the line and you've already crossed some threshold that you can't reverse back to. And so the benefit to doing the models and investing in some of the scenarios of what might happen in the future are unknown. We don't know until we go there.
Yeah, don't get me wrong, by my question, I had no problem with investing in the models. I just really wanted to understand is there can be a great reluctance by communities to support that effort of information. However, if you don't know what the risks are of not knowing, it's harder for you to balance out that investment. I want to kind of understand a little bit more, thank you for the answers, on what the risks are.
that'd be a great study in itself.
And I would just say one thing about groundwater pumping. Of course, you turn off a well, those impacts continue to expand for as long as the well was pumping. So that's something that, you really need predictive models to help you, project those, simulate those conditions.
Well, it's time to give them a great round of applause.